The crowd, the very street itself, sways to and fro on a sea of sheer elation. This vast body of emotion pulls you along like a rip current, depositing you into the embrace of strangers and champagne. Flags swim ahead and newspapers fall like confetti. War over. The war is over. The currents deposit you next into the arms of a mother who just lost both of her sons, then into those of a daughter whose father rots in some far-off land, and you start to realize that not every wave in this sea is made of joy. Indeed, every third face is tight with pain, and the unfillable voids in so many hearts bring throngs of grandmothers, grandfathers, sisters, and brothers to their knees, clutching for something they will never hold again. The sea turns red, and the newspaper confetti turns to ash. The city which stood gleaming all around you falls to ruin, reeking of hot bullets and burning skin, and what was once cheering and singing becomes the wailing cacophony of hell. World War II may be over, but the suffering isn't, and no matter how hard you try, you know things will never go back to how they were. Things can never be the same again. World War II is a scar humanity will wear forever, and the wound continues to sting. Rebuilding things the way they were is impossible, but many of us have lived good lives and experienced joy so much that we forget, from time to time, the scar is even there. But what exactly was there to rebuild? What was broken? Well, the answer is everything. Though in this video, we're going to discuss the chaos left in the wake of the Second World War and provide some examples of what humanity did about it. One immediate impact was human casualties. Some 75 to 85 million people died as a result of the war, and this is about 4% of the population. While many of the bodies were buried, burnt, or otherwise disposed of throughout the war, many continued to rot when it ended, often far from home. Those that could be identified and returned home were, though those that weren't were buried without a name. Regardless, disposing of the dead was an immense chore in itself. As for rebuilding the population, well, there is only one way to do that. But rebuilding families, that could only be done with love and time. Mind you, those figures of 75 to 80 million were just deaths. Think of all those wounded in the war, the amputees, the heat and chemical burn victims. Prosthetics are only so effective as organic limbs, and some burns never fade. Consider also the genetic damage inflicted by chemical and nuclear warfare. The radiation of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings still echoes through the Japanese people. Nor can we forget the mental scars. PTSD plagued many veterans until the day they died, and it was never really cured, only managed. The families of these tormented souls suffered their portion too, bearing the weight through the generations. Casualties include captures too, and there were two sides to this coin in the aftermath of the war. POWs freed and possibly repatriated, and surrendered enemies taken as POWs. Both of these are logistical nightmares, though there was an emotional element to it too. POWs had first to be set free, then processed, and then transported, hopefully home. Often, this was between countries, if not continents. Some POWs never made it home, while it took others years. As for new POWs, they had first to be captured, processed, and interned. Many Germans, for instance, were interned in POW camps in Allied occupation zones in Germany. Others were assigned to forced labor, as many were captured by the Red Army. While many POWs were put in camps and made to work, others were tried, convicted, and executed for war crimes. While there is certainly an argument that many of these criminals deserved death, this was still a costly process, and it certainly took a toll on the people facilitating it. But at the end of the day, some things just can't be rebuilt, only wiped from the face of the earth. As we'll mention when we discuss the ruination of residential property and the expulsion of people from occupied and annexed territories, Some 11 million people were made refugees after the war, and this resulted in millions more casualties, often by starvation, disease, and exposure. While some lost their homes or were forced out of them, as we mentioned before, many were former POWs and slave laborers. As for rebuilding, temporary facilities for displaced persons were established throughout Europe, housing some 850,000 people by late 1947, Poles, Greeks, and Russians, to name a few. Some overseas nations took refugees too. Australia, for instance, set up things like the Displaced Persons Program, which allowed 170,000 refugees to enter the country between 1947 and 1951. Another immediate was the ruins. Entire cities pulverized into the earth. Atomized cities were, of course, a nightmare to clean, though their resurrections are also the most literal example of rebuilding possible. Truly symbolic. While Hiroshima and Nagasaki take the cake, we can't forget Warsaw, which was torn apart by the Luftwaffe in 1939 and thoroughly finished by the Heer in revenge for the Warsaw Uprising. And nor Berlin, which was pummeled with shellfire right up until the Red Army swept through, nor Dresden, which the Allies turned into a flaming hell on earth. You can walk through any of these cities today. They have been remade, though most left pieces of their pre-resurrection skeletons standing in the sun, testament to all they've endured. Of course, with so many industrial and residential structures destroyed, many were out of jobs and homes. Foreign occupation and territorial changes were a nightmare too. Borders were redrawn and nations both claimed new territories and rescinded old ones. Allied organizations such as the Allied Control Council, which administered control of occupied Germany, were established, though not all occupation was regulated. The Soviet Union, for instance, annexed the countries it invaded on its march west to Berlin, making satellite states of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, to name a few. Whereas Japan was forced to return Manchuria to China, and the Philippines, Burma, French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and other territories to the Allied nations claiming to own them. Many citizens were forced out of their homes and their countries, becoming refugees. To put it in perspective, some 10 million Germans were expelled from the occupation zones established by the Allied Control Council, and between 1.5 and 2 million of them died in the process. Regaining territory lost in the war may have been part of rebuilding, but the Soviet Union annexing countries created a whole new mess. We brushed over unemployment, but we've barely considered economical impacts. Like we said, industrial infrastructure was hammered throughout the war, with Europe, for instance, losing 70% of its total infrastructure. But not all of it was destroyed in the fighting. Germany, for example, was made to destroy hundreds of its manufacturing plants after it capitulated, rendering it incapable of raising a significant military and putting thousands out of jobs. Continuing with Germany as an example, the reconstruction process was long and arduous, though the dismantling of industry in West Germany, at least, ended in 1950, allowing it some room to breathe. Demilitarization had similar effects, and Allied military occupation in West Germany didn't end until 1955. But it wasn't all destructive. The US, for instance, set up a $12 billion foreign aid initiative called the Marshall Plan in 1948, designed to rebuild Western Europe physically, remove trade barriers, modernize industry, and generally improve prosperity. Oh, and staunch the spread of communism, of course. Though we can't forget war reparations, which took a massive toll on Germany, Japan, and Italy. The defeated powers paid the Allies reparations ranging from hundreds of millions to billions of US dollars, and while this put them under the thumb, it certainly helped the Allies rebuild. But financial hardships weren't limited to defeated nations, and some Allied nations, such as Britain, racked up crippling war debts. As for Britain, it owed the US billions of dollars by the end of the war. Fortunately, Britain was able to negotiate the Anglo-American Loan Agreement, which allowed it to stay afloat and pay the debt slowly, right up until 2006. Of course, the whole world was tense after the war, and this resulted in subsequent conflicts, some not quite the same scale, but just as bloody. For instance, tensions between the capitalist Western Bloc and communist Eastern Bloc were manifested in the Cold War, and one of the first bloody conflicts of this was the Chinese Civil War. The capitulation of their common enemy, Imperial Japan, saw the Chinese communists and nationalists back at each other's throats, and the Chinese Civil War resumed, with the communists eventually gaining victory. And a desire for decolonization resulted in the First Indochina War and the Malayan Emergency, in which both the former French and British colonies achieved independence. All these conflicts created further chaos, adding to the stack, and how we've been rebuilding after each of them are topics worthy of their own videos. But some tensions don't always manifest in war. Some are held not by political leaders, but the people. The people never forget, and they rarely forgive, and conflicts such as World War II shape our social and cultural climates, inciting distrust and hatred between people of different nations and races. Mending this is part of the long game rebuilding process, and it can't be downplayed. Yes, World War II is a trauma humanity will bear forever, but maybe that's a good thing. We've got to learn from mistakes like this, and as cheesy as it sounds, build a better and brighter future. A lot of bad came out of the war, but some stepped up to the challenge and at least tried to fix things up and make them better. There was some light in all that darkness. But we'd like to know what you think. Do you disagree with anything we said? Can you think of any other broad-scale impacts of the war? And can you think of any other good examples of how humanity tried to rebuild? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and we'll be sure to respond to some of the good ones. And just before you go guys, make sure you check out all those juicy links in the description as well. If you're keen to talk to other history buffs and get all the sources for every single video, then do check out our Discord server. And if you want to help support the channel more than you already are by watching this video, please do check out the Patreon as well. Every dollar helps improve the quality and quantity of videos we produce here on the channel. Anyways guys, as always, thank you for watching, and I hope you've learned something new.